Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Dharma podcast. In today's episode, we will discuss the little known story of how Nawab Nehru was completely brainwashed during a single visit to Soviet Russia and how he became the patron saint of communism in India. So let's begin today's episode with a straightforward question. Who visits a large communist country, spends 4 splendid days being lavishly wined, dined, and entertained, and then returns to India and writes an entire book filled with mounds of ironclad opinions and judgments on that communist country based entirely on the experience of those 4 days? The answer: Nawab Nehru. In fact, Nawab Nehru's single-handed and determined service in spreading and nurturing communism in India arguably exceeds the combined efforts of mainstream communist organizations and forces including the Communist Party of India of that era. By all standards, Nawab Nehru is the original patron saint of communism in India. Now let's dive into the episode. And in all this, there is a small matter of nuance. Nawab Nehru's incurable addiction to communism is actually rooted in his original addiction to the Soviet Union itself. And we have his own words as proof for this, and we'll look at some of those as we go along. Now, unlike Nawab Nehru, but like every transnational imperialist cult, the Soviet Union or the USSR had perfect clarity in their ultimate goals and methods. The history of how the communists, after capturing Russia in a violent coup, how they spread their tentacles throughout the world has a common theme. And in this common theme, in every non-communist country, these communists cultivated the social and the business elite of non-communist countries by flattering their egos, by hunting upon their insecurities and painting ideological and compelling textual and verbal pictures of a future paradise in which this elite would rule. The other tactics of these communists was to seduce the rich heiresses, wives and daughters of the super wealthy to gain access to influential political circles. And Soviet Russia implemented the same tactic to spread communism in India as well. And by choosing Nawab Nehru, Soviet Russia had indeed chosen well. Its leaders quickly understood Nawab Nehru's basic character. They correctly saw him as a pampered, pompous and overgrown teenager who could be manipulated and bent at their will. These Soviet agents also knew that Nawab Nehru was not only deracinated and cut off completely from his Hindu cultural roots, but that he was also a loyal disciple of the British communist agent and the economics professor named Harold Lasky. Now, this Harold Lasky, sitting in London, had infected the minds of several generations of students with communist ideology. And apart from this, we also need to look at the political climate of that period. During that era, British colonialism was at its peak both in India and elsewhere in the world, and Britain and USSR were openly hostile to each other. Britain especially viewed communist Russia with a deep and well-founded suspicion and kept a close watch on communist activities in England. And on the international stage, the USSR proclaimed itself as the leader of all anti-imperialist and anti-colonial forces of the world, and it extended generous patronage to the leaders of various freedom movements in colonized countries. With this backdrop, let us quickly move on to the year 1927. In November 1927, the Soviet Union hosted a grand celebration to commemorate 1 decade of the Great October Communist Revolution that took place in 1917 in Russia. And accordingly, the Soviet Society for Cultural Relations sent an invitation to the Nehru family to witness with their own eyes the magic that the communist revolution had created in Russia. And so, in November 1927, Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Vijayalakshmi Pandit visited Moscow and received a splendid welcome. Even today, you can check out the pictures of that visit on the internet. Nawab Nehru and his whole clan spent 4 full days in Soviet Russia, and 4 days were more than enough to hook him on to lifelong communist addiction. Nehru was so thoroughly brainwashed by the elaborate charade that the USSR had organized for him that he became a champion apologist for every crime that Soviet Russia inflicted both on its own citizens and throughout the world. Just 4 full days of non-stop whining and dining and flattery were enough for Nawab Nehru to come back to India and write tons of copious nonsense about the alleged glories of the Soviet paradise with an air of final authority and judgment. Eventually, all these articles were compiled and published as a book titled Soviet Russia, Some Random Sketches and Impressions, which was published in 1949. This book was translated into various languages and it was massively publicized by the communist organizations in India. This book was also made mandatory reading for the communist cadre and it was celebrated as a definitive book for understanding the great paradise called the Soviet Union. This, among other reasons, is why I called Nawab Nehru as the patron saint of communism in India. And what does that book say about the Soviet Union, which Nawab Nehru saw with his own eyes? Let's not forget that Nawab Nehru was 38 years old when he made his maiden visit to Russia. And when you read the prose in his book, it sounds like it was written by a high school boy who is eager to impress his headmistress. Now, I have to mention a contemporary parallel with this phenomenon. We notice a repeat of Nawab Nehru's gushing prose more than 80 years later. Former US President Barack Obama, in his autobiography, describes his first impression of Nehru's great grandson in a similar language, and I quote, Rahul Gandhi has a nervous, unformed quality about him, as if he were a student who had done the coursework and was eager to impress the teacher, but deep down he lacked either the aptitude or the passion to master the subject. As I always say in my episodes, what has really changed? In fact, the quality of the Nehru dynasty's blood has remained undiluted till date. Now let's return to Nawab Nehru's book and ask a logical question. What was the raw material for Nawab Nehru's uncritical and highly flattering descriptions of Soviet Russia? The answer, the raw material was the pamphlets and handouts and other propaganda material that the Russian government gave him and which he swallowed uncritically with the eagerness of a devout Hajj pilgrim. And when we read Nawab Nehru's book, it becomes clear that he follows a very, very simple equation. He praises anything or anyone who praises Russia, and he dismisses and condemns anybody who is critical of Soviet Russia. Now, my dear friends, tell me, how can anybody go wrong with such an infallible formula? In fact, the very first essay of Nawab Nehru's book is unambiguously titled Fascination of Russia. And in this chapter, Nawab Nehru equates Soviet Russia using another version of the same infallible formula that I mentioned. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it is indeed a duck. Here is a sample of Nawab Nehru's logic in that chapter. Russia is a large country and India is also a large country. Therefore, Russia is equal to India. Next, Russia is a large agrarian country and India is also a large agrarian country. Therefore, Russia is equal to India. Next, Russia has a large peasant population which was poor. India also has a large peasant population which is still poor. Therefore, to solve this poverty problem, India must take inspiration from the communist revolution in Russia and also have a goal of communist revolution out here. And like I said, you can never go wrong with this kind of logic. The next source material for Nawab Nehru's book is his actual visit to Russia itself. This visit was carefully orchestrated down to its last dirty detail from the moment he stepped into the luxury train that Russia had sponsored for him and his family. Remember that when Nawab Nehru stepped into the train, the whole world was bitterly critical of Russia's massive shortages and unemployment, but Nawab Nehru didn't seem the least bit surprised that he was provided such a luxury class sleeping compartment in the train and was treated with enormous amounts of rich food and drink. Quite the contrary. The book shows in Nehru's own words how he was completely seduced by the Russian hospitality and he cannot simply stop gushing about it. I quote a couple of excerpts from his book. We had already taken our dinner, but the station staff produced large quantities of food and after the Indian fashion would have no refusal. We had to comply with their wishes. Our berths had been reserved by our hosts and we had a very comfortable journey. There is only one class in Russian trains, but they have some special sleeping cars and we had been provided with these. Close quote. These are his own words. And so, my dear friends and fellow Hindus, here is the thing. The next time you criticize all these five-star freeloading culture of Lutyens media, please remember that their favorite Nawab Nehru had himself set this freeloading precedent more than 80 years ago. The apple does not fall far from the tree. So, Russia's finely orchestrated stage show, it manifested itself throughout Nawab Nehru's journey. Let's listen to what he says next, and I quote. We travelled the whole night and the greater part of the next day, arriving at Moscow the next afternoon. All the stations en route were decorated with flags and pictures in honor of the anniversary of the revolution. The men and women and children we saw at the stations were well clad and most of them had great coats reaching to their ankles and big Russian boots up to their knees. Close quote. You know, it is so incredible when we read this kind of stuff now, because only the opaque genius of Nawab Nehru could actually believe that all this pomp and show of prosperity was real and true in a hardcore oppressive communist dictatorship like Russia. But of course, this dictatorship had precisely selected Nawab Nehru because they understood his psychology and they grasped the fact that only Nehru could believe that this drama was real. And when Nehru went around the streets of Moscow and he saw the actual living conditions of ordinary Russians with his own eyes, he began to have misgivings, and he also wrote about them in his book. And I quote, "There were no great coats or big Russian boots to be seen anywhere. Clothes were substandard and badly made, and there was shortage of essential commodities." Close quote. These are his own words. Now the story gets even more interesting, because by now Nawab Nehru had turned into a firm believer of communism, and he had acquired the fine art of inventing justifications and apologies for Soviet Russia. And so he reasoned that all these shortages and lack of spending power were actually proof of the Russian people's commitment to the egalitarian communist ideology. And this is how he, writes his apologia, and I quote, "Many Russians, of course, could not afford to buy anything expensive. But apart from the question of expense, it was considered a bourgeois failing to waste time and money on clothes." Close quote. By now, Nawab Nehru's psychological ambush by communist Russia's leadership was near complete. Only a final step remained. On November 8, 1927, as the special guests of the Soviet state, the Nehru family took part in a ceremonial celebration marking the 10th anniversary of the 1917 revolution. Motilal Nehru and Nawab Nehru were given a standing ovation by a large crowd when they were introduced to the audience. And with this, Nawab Nehru's seduction was complete. Now, we move on to the next stage of his brainwashing, but before that, we have to also understand one important point. India back then was firmly under British colonial rule, and neither Motilal Nehru nor Nawab Nehru nor anyone in the Nehru family had any kind of autonomous independent government position. So in what capacity did Russia invite these private citizens and made them their state guests? When you ask these questions, great clarity ensues. Next, Nawab Nehru was personally received in the Kremlin by Michael Kalinin, who was a chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR, which is a position equivalent to the President of India in today's parlance. And there, he was escorted by the powerful officialdom of Russian government to visit the new marvels allegedly created by the Great Revolution. Nehru was taken on visits to large factories, Russian courts, the Museum of the October Revolution, and the famous Bolshoi Theatre. Apart from all these, two places especially impressed Nawab Nehru. The first was Lenin's mummy in Moscow, and when Nawab Nehru saw it, he was deeply moved in almost in a sexual way. The memory haunts him, and he is unable to control his emotion for this genocidal maniac named Lenin, who slaughtered 7 million of his own countrymen. And Nawab Nehru writes with great passion about Lenin in his book, and I quote, "He lies asleep as it were, and it is difficult to believe that he is dead. In life, they say he was not beautiful to look at. He had too much of common clay in him, and about him was a smell of the Russian soil. But in death, there is a strange beauty, and his brow is peaceful and unclouded. On his lips there hovers a smile, and there is a suggestion of pugnacity, of work done and success achieved. He has a uniform on, and one of his hands is lightly clenched. Even in death he is a dictator. In India, he would certainly have been canonized. Close quote. You know, reading this felt so puke-worthy and disgusting that I think I should cleanse my mouth with tulsi water or something. This kind of thing brings us back again to the same thing that I mentioned earlier in this episode. This sort of childish writing is a classic example of adolescent prose written to impress the English teacher on which you have a great crush. Anyway, so the next place that Nawab Nehru visits is the prison system of Soviet Russia. Out there, he is immediately stunned and highly impressed at how compassionate and humane it is. And he is simultaneously furious at all the lies that the media printed about the brutality of the Soviet prison system. Nawab Nehru's fury shows in his prose, and I quote, "We are told of the Red Terror, and ghastly and horrible details are provided for our consumption. Our own visit to the chief prison in Moscow created the most favorable impression on our minds. Anyone with a knowledge of prisons in India and of the barbarous way in which handcuffs, fetters, and other punishments are used will appreciate the difference. The governor of the prison in Moscow who took us around was all the time laying stress on the human side of jail life and how it was their endeavor to keep this in front and not to make the prisoner feel in any way dehumanized. It can be said without a shadow of doubt that to be in a Russian prison is far more preferable than to be a worker in an Indian factory." Close quote. This is unbelievable at multiple levels, but you make your own conclusions. What we notice here again is how Nawab Nehru's infallible formula is at work. Anyone with even basic common sense will clearly see that the Russian prison governor obviously concealed the real truth about the Russian prison system, and Nawab Nehru, who was now an absolutely committed believer of communism, actually believed the prison officials' lies. What we also notice here and in his other writings is that India always appears as a backward, wretched and disgusting country to Nehru's eyes, which was bewitched by Soviet communism. In essence, these are all the raw materials and the first-hand experiences that Nawab Nehru used in order to pontificate about the glory of Soviet Russia. And when he returned to India, Nawab Nehru had become an incurable Soviet addict, to borrow the memorable words of the late great Shri Sitaram Goel. If that is not enough, Nawab Nehru writes that the USSR could never do any wrong because, and I quote his words, "the October Revolution was undoubtedly one of the great events of world history, the greatest since the first French Revolution, and its story is more absorbing from human and dramatic point of view. It is difficult to feel indifference towards Russia, and it is more difficult to judge her achievements impartially." Close quote. He is asking us to become a blind Soviet stooge or a Soviet addict like he was. All this and similar writings of Nawab Nehru show that he had a perverse sort of fondness for violent revolution and genocidal dictators like Lenin and Stalin. This also proves how horribly, how badly Nawab Nehru was deracinated. In fact, if Nehru had truly understood the civilizational impulse and the cultural pulse of Sanatana Bharatavarsha, he would have intuitively understood that all the great changes that occurred throughout the history of Bharatavarsha occurred through bloodless internal reform and not through violent revolutions and regime changes. And nothing that I have narrated in this podcast is hidden from the public in some secret document or whatever. In fact, the Soviet approach of treating India as an illegitimate state which has no right to exist is a matter of widely accessible public record. It would be very hard to believe that Nawab Nehru was unaware of all this. But then, we expect too much from him. And because all addictions are fatal, Nawab Nehru never ever gave up his communist addiction till the end, and he doggedly persisted in giving out patronage to Indian communists. And once again, Shri Sitaram Goel says it best about Nawab Nehru, and I quote, Pandit Nehru has always nursed the communists in India with the fondness of an old woman who gave birth to her first and only child at an advanced age. Close quote. And on that rather sarcastic note, we can conclude this episode of the Dharma podcast. I sincerely hope that you found this episode useful and informative. As always, please click the like button to help the YouTube algorithm. Do subscribe to our channel, share our videos widely, and please consider making a contribution of your choice so that we can continue to offer more such valuable and educational content. Namaste, Vande Mataram.